everyone, and we are back. We are reading Among the Impostors. So, Luke Garner is now Lee Grant. I guess that's a little bit of a theme of the books that I've been doing for these read-alouds, that we had Jack became Zach, who then became Mac, and now it's Luke that became Lee. But in here, Luke was a third child who was in hiding. He met Jen because he kind of saw her, and long story short, he now is out in the open. He had to leave home, and he is at Hendrick's School for Boys. His first interaction with his first classmate has not gone well, and now he is in a class that is about the Greeks. So let's find out what this new school has in store for Luke. So we ended here, and the Greeks were... Sit down, he interrupted himself impatiently. He was looking at Luke. Me? Luke squeaked. Where should I sit? His voice wasn't much more than a whisper. There was no way the man could have heard him, all the way at the front of the room. Probably the boy sitting a foot away hadn't even heard him, but suddenly every boy in the room turned around and stared at Luke. It was awful. All those eyes, all looking at him, it was straight out of Luke's worst nightmares. Panic rooted him to the spot, but every muscle in his body was screaming for him to run, to hide anywhere he could. For 12 years, his entire life, he had to hide. To be seen was death. Don't! He wanted to scream. Don't look at me! Don't report me, please! But the muscles that controlled his mouth were as frozen as the rest of him. The tiny part of his mind that wasn't flooded with panic knew that was good. Now that he had a fake ID, the last thing he should do was act like a boy who's had to hide. But to act normal, he needed to move, to obey. The man at the front end sit down, and he couldn't make his body do that either. Then someone kicked him. Ow! Luke crumbled. Rough hands jerked him backwards. Miraculously, he landed on the corner of a chair, barely regained his balance, and managed not to fall completely. He slid into his right and was solidly in his sleep. Thank you, the man at the front said, with exaggerated, mocking gratitude. See me after class. As I was saying before, I was so rudely interrupted. The Greeks were quite technologically advanced for their time. Then Luke could no longer hear the man's words over the buzzing in his ears. His heart kept thumping hard, as if it, at least, still thought Luke would be wise to run. But Luke resolutely gripped the edge of the chair. He was acting normal now, wasn't he? The boys who had been staring at him slowly began turning back to face the teacher again. Luke wiped sweat from his forehead and looked around for whoever had kicked and pulled and shoved him. Had they been trying to help him? Luke desperately wanted to believe that. But all the boys near him were looking at the teacher, nonchalantly, as though Luke weren't even there. And if they'd been trying to help, wouldn't they be there trying to catch Luke's eye to get him to say thanks? Luke really didn't know. He knew how his family would act. Mother and Dad, Matthew and Mark. Mother and Dad would never kick him, and his older brothers would be poking him now, taunting him. Want us to kick you again? The only other people Luke had ever met before today were Jen's dad, who was practically as big a mystery as the boy sitting behind him now, and Jen. And Jen would... Luke couldn't bear to think about Jen. A bell rang suddenly, and it was such an alarming sound that Luke's heart set to pounding again. Remember Chapter 12, the teacher called as all the boys scrambled up. Luke meant to go see the teacher as he'd been instructed. This had to be the end of the class, but the tide of boys swept him out the back of the door of the classroom before he quite knew what was happening. By the time he finally got his feet firmly on the ground and felt like he might be able to break away, he was around a corner and down another hall. He fought his way back to what he thought was the original hallway, but then he couldn't figure out which way to turn. He looked all around, frantically, searching for either the teacher or Rolly, as nasty as he'd been. Rolly was at least sort of familiar, but all the faces that flowed past him were strangers. Of course, the way Luke's mind was working, both Rolly and the teacher could have paraded Luke past Luke 5 times, and he might not have even recognized them. The crowd in the hall was thinning out. Luke began to panic again. Get to class, an older boy standing nearby ordered him. Where? Luke said. Where's my class? The boy didn't hear him. Luke thought about asking again, louder, but the boy seemed to be at some sort of guard, someone in charge, like a policeman, like the population police. Luke put his hand over his mouth and veered away. Down another hall, another bell rang, and boys started running, desperate to get into their classrooms. Hopelessly, Luke followed a group of 3 or 4 through a doorway into another classroom. At least he thought it was another classroom. For all he knew, he might have circled around and gone into the same one all over again. Maybe that was good. Maybe after class this time he could make it up to talk to the teacher. It was a short, fat man who stood up to talk this time. As confused and panicky as Luke felt, even he could tell it wasn't the same teacher. Luke hastily sat down, terrified of drawing attention to himself again. He resolved to listen carefully this time, to pay attention and learn. He owed it to everyone, to Mother and Dad, to Jen's father, even to Jen herself. It was 10 minutes before he realized that the man at the front of the class was speaking some other language, one Luke had never heard before and didn't have a prayer of understanding. When the bell rang after this class, Luke didn't even try to go against the crowd. This time, the flow of traffic carried him into a huge room with tables instead of desks and bookshelves instead of portraits on the wall. All the other boys sat down and pulled out books and paper and pens and pencils. Homework. They were doing homework. Luke felt brilliant for figuring that out. How many times had he watched his older brothers groan over math problems, stumble over reading assignments, scratch out answers in history workbooks? Matthew and Mark did not like school. Once, years ago, Luke had began peering over Mark's shoulder at his homework and noticed an easy mistake. Isn't 8 times 4 32? He'd innocently asked. You wrote down 34. Mark stuck out his tongue and pushed so hard on his pencil the lead broke. See what you made me do, he complained. If you're so smart, why don't you go to school for me? Mother was hovering over them. Hush, she said to Mark, and that had been the end of it. Luke's family didn't dwell on what they all knew. Because Luke was the third born, he was illegal, violating the population law with every breath he took and every bite of food he ate. Of course he couldn't go to school or anywhere else. But here he was, now at school. And it wasn't Matthew and Mark's little country school, but a grand fancy place that only the richest people, barons, could afford. Rich people like the real Lee Grant, who died in a skiing accident. His family had concealed his death and secretly given his identity card to help a shadow child come out of hiding. Couldn't everyone tell that Luke was an imposter? Luke wished the real Lee Grant were still alive. He wished that he, himself, were still at home, hiding. Young man, someone said in a warning voice. Luke glanced around. He was the only one still standing. Quickly, he slipped into the nearest vacant chair. He didn't have any books to study or work to do. Maybe this was the time to read the note from Jen's dad. As he reached into his pocket, he knew it wasn't safe. The boy across the table from him kept looking up. The boy, 2 chairs down, kept whispering and pointing. Though Luke kept his head down, he could feel all eyes around him. Even if no one was looking directly at him, Luke felt itchy and anxious just being in the same room with so many other people. He couldn't read the note. He could barely keep himself from bolting out of his chair, running out the door, finding some closet or small space to hide in. And then everybody would know he wasn't really Lee Grant. Everybody would know that all he knew was how to hide. Luke forced himself to sit still for 2 hours. When the bell went off again, everyone trooped down the hall to a huge dining area. Luke hadn't eaten since breakfast at home, his mother's lightest biscuits, and as a miraculous farewell treat, fresh eggs. Luke could remember the pride shining in her eyes as she slid the plate in front of him. From the factory, he asked. Eggs were usually not available for ordinary people, but his mother worked at a chicken factory, and if her supervisors were in good mood, sometimes she got extra food. Mother had nodded. I promised them 40 hours of overtime in exchange, unpaid. Luke had gulped. Just for 2 eggs for me? Mother had looked at him. It was a good trade, she said. Remembering breakfast gave him a lump in his throat, as big as an egg. He wasn't hungry. But he sat down because all the other boys were sitting. Instantly, another boy turned on him and glared. Seniors only, he said. Huh? Luke asked. Only seniors are allowed at this table, the boy said in the same kind of mocking voice that Mark always used with Luke when Luke had said something dumb. Oh, Luke said. What are you, some kind of lecker? Another boy asked. Luke didn't know how to answer that. He was so eager to get up, he tripped and crashed into the next table. Juniors only, a boy said there. Luke tried to swallow the lump in his throat, but it had grown even bigger. He went from table to table, not even bothering to try to sit down. At each table, someone said in a bored voice, "Sophomores only," or "Freshmen only," or "Eights only." Luke didn't know what he was, so he kept moving. Finally, he reached an empty table and sat down. A bowl of leaves and what looked like a germinating soybean sat in front of him. Was this supposed to be food? The other boys were eating it, so he did too. The leaves were clammy and bitter and stuck to his throat. Luke let himself think about potato chips. Nobody was supposed to have junk food because of the food shortages that led to the population law, but Jen had given him potato chips when he'd gone over to her house, secretly, at great risk. He could still taste the salt, could still feel the crisp chips against the roof of his mouth, could still hear Jen saying, when he protested that potato chips were illegal, "Yeah, well, we're illegal too, so why don't we enjoy ourselves?" Jen. If Jen were here now, she wouldn't put up with bitter leaves and tasteless bean sprouts for supper. She'd be standing up, demanding decent food. She'd go to any table she wanted. She'd march up to the person in charge, the headmaster, and say, "Why won't anyone tell me what classes to go to? What are the merits? What are the rules? Anyways, you're not running this school very well." She'd punch Rolly right in the eye. But Jen wasn't there. Jen was dead. Luke bent his head low over his food. He stopped even pretending to chew and swallow. After supper, everyone was herded into another vast room. A man stood at the front talking about how glorious the government was, about how their leader's wisdom had kept them all from starving. Lies, Luke thought, and marveled that he had the will to even think that. Finally, another bell rang and the other boys scattered. Luke walked uncertainly up and down strange halls. "To your room," a man warned him. "Lights out in 10 minutes." Luke was so eager to get to his room, he actually found his voice. I'm new. I don't know where my room is." "Well, then find out." "How?" Luke asked. The man sighed and rolled his eyes. "What's your name?" he asked slowly, as though Luke might be too stupid to understand the question. Somehow Luke couldn't bring himself to claim his fake identity. "I know my room number, 156. I just don't remember where it is." "Why didn't you say so?" the man growled. "Up those stairs and around the corner." Even with the man's direction, Luke got turned around and had to search and search. By the time he finally saw the engraved 156, his legs were trembling with exhaustion and his feet were blistered from walking in the stiff, unfamiliar shoes. Luke was used to going barefoot. He was used to sitting in the house all day, not walking up and down stairs and through labyrinth-like halls. He stepped through the doorway and headed straight for his bed. It had a spread on it and looked like all the others now. All Luke wanted to do was fall into it and go to sleep and forget everything that happened that day. "Did you ask permission?" someone barked at him. Luke looked around. He was so tired he hadn't even noticed the 7 boys were sitting on a floor in a circle, playing some sort of card game. Permission?" he asked. One of the boys, probably the one who'd spoken, threw his head back and laughed. He was tall and thin and older than Luke, maybe even as old as Luke's brother Matthew, who was 15. But Matthew was familiar known. Luke couldn't read this boy's expression. He had a strange cast to his dark eyes, and his face was oddly shaped. Something about him reminded Luke of the picture he had seen in a book of jackals. "Hey," the boy said. "They sent us a voice replicator. Amazingly human-like form. Voice is a little off, though. Let's try another one. Repeat after me. I am an Ixnay. I am a Fonroll. I am a Lecker. I don't deserve to live." Most of the other boys were laughing now too, but quietly, as if they didn't want to miss Luke's answer. Luke hesitated. He'd heard those words before. Rolly had called him an Exnay and a Fonroll, and someone had called him a Lecker at dinner. Maybe they were from that foreign language the short, fat teacher had been speaking. Luke had no idea what the words meant, but he could tell that they were probably bad things. Thanks to Matthew and Mark, he could spot a setup. Luke shook his head. The jackal boy sighed in exaggerated disappointment. "Broken already," he said. He stood up and knocked his fist against Luke's side, the way Luke had seen his father tap on the engine of broken tractors or trucks. "You just can't get good junk nowadays." Luke pulled away. He stepped toward his bed. Jackal Boy laughed again. "Oh no, not so fast. Permission, remember? Say, 'I am your servant, almighty master. I shall do your bidding.' forever. I will not eat or sleep or breathe unless you say it to be so. The boy moved between Luke and his bed. The others leaned forward, menacingly, like a pack of jackals, Luke thought. Jackals were nasty, vicious animals. Luke had read a book about them. They tore their prey limb from limb sometimes. These were really boys, not jackals, Luke reminded himself, but he was too tired to fight. I am your servant, he mumbled. I don't remember the rest. Why do they always send us the stupid ones? The jackal boy asked. He looked down at Luke. Bet you don't even know your name. Lee, Luke whispered, looking down his shoes. Lee, repeat after me. I am. The jackal boy fed him each word, and Luke, hating himself, repeated it. The boy then made him touch his elbow to his nose, cross his eyes, stand on one foot while reciting, I am the lowest of the low, everyone should spit on me, 5 times. The lights flickered and went out in the middle of this ordeal, and still the jackal boy continued. Finally he yawned. Luke could hear his jaw crack in the dark. New boy, you bore me. Remove yourself from my presence. And that's where we'll end for today. Luke is not having the best of first experiences in this new school. What else will it have in store for him? We'll find out next time. Have a good day, everyone.